Alrighty. Now we know the folks that are very interested in the topic or really need the CLE hours. But for our final panel, we're going to look at what we've learned from the experiments with drug legalization thus far. First, we're going to hear from John Hudak, who is a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution and the editor of their FixGov blog. And then we're going to hear from Douglas Berman on some of the questions and challenges that relate to how we are actually going forward, understand what the consequences of state-level marijuana reforms are. And like John Hudak, he is also, in addition to being the Robert J. Watkins Proctor and Gamble Professor of Law at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, he is also the editor of two blogs, Sentencing Law and Policy and Marijuana Law and Policy. If you're interested in these issues, certainly the Marijuana Law and Policy blog, which some other folks that have presented today also occasionally contribute to, is worth checking out. But he's going to talk about some of the challenges for researchers and policymakers in being able to understand what the effects of state-level reforms might be. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John Hudak. One quick announcement: at 4 o'clock we are going to have a reception. So there is, in addition to the additional knowledge and enlightenment that you get from hanging out for the last panel, there is additional refreshments at the end. So again, thank you for being here, and turn it over to John.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank Jonathan for organizing what I'm sure all of you agree with me has been a great conference, and thank you to Case for hosting us. Angela said before that she was sort of odd in the room and that she wasn't a law professor or a lawyer. I share the same vice, I guess. Although she said she was a normal person, I would not go so far as to say that about myself. But regardless, my training is in political science, and so I'm going to, what I've done in my work is to blend what is my bread and butter, that is studying elections and policy implementation, though normally at the federal level, and using marijuana as a policy by which I could engage my own general research interests. And so I did that in May with a trip to Colorado to examine how implementation is going. This is something that is critically important to the experiment that is Colorado marijuana legalization, but something that not many people are talking about. People are grasping at all the data that they can to see what the policy effects are in Colorado and likewise in Washington and in many of the medical marijuana states. But no one is approaching it from a governance perspective. And so that's what I sought to do. And so to provide an overview, what most of you, or all of you I'm sure already know, in November of 2012, Colorado passed Amendment 64 with about a 55% majority that legalized recreational marijuana. It authorized home grows. It asked the state to construct a regulatory system around that. And Colorado was off and running. And for a lot of reasons, we should think that experiment would fail. States, in many cases, are not that great at implementing policy, particularly new policies where there's no real model to work from. Although there are certainly exceptions to that, it's risky. Expertise is not as high typically in state governments as it is at the federal government, and as a result of that, we often worry about these experiments. The states have been called laboratories of democracy for good reason, because a lot of ideas are generated there, and so are a lot of failures. And when you look at a policy area like marijuana legalization, which in the way that it's being conducted in Colorado and in Washington is in many ways unprecedented, you worry that there would be a challenge. Compounding that challenge, of course, is a federal structure that continues to criminalize marijuana. And also in Colorado, a state leadership, essentially top to bottom, that opposed it. The governor, the attorney general, and others who opposed this measure. So as I said earlier, I focus on policy implementation at the federal level, and when there's political opposition at the federal level to policy, we see the results every day, whether it's in the financial sector, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in defense and in foreign policy. It can lead to really serious challenges, and that's what Colorado was facing going into November 2012, and really on election day looking forward at what would happen. But despite that, for those of you who have read the paper, it's working. The implementation, at least, is working in Colorado. They've done what the amendment in many ways charged them to do, and that was set up a regulatory structure that would allow residents 21 years of age and older to purchase marijuana for recreational purposes. It allowed product to come to market on time, in fact. Regulations were generally promulgated on time in what was a fairly rushed process. And so my approach after looking into this and observing whether it worked was also to try to understand why it worked. And there were a few reasons why this was, or at least is up to this point, a fairly successful experiment. One of them is that Colorado had a previous medical system in place. And I think that is something that a lot of people hold up as a basis for why Colorado has had a fairly smooth transition into recreational legalization. But what most people fail to acknowledge is that there were ups and downs with the Colorado medical experiment. And I think the ups, as well as some of the challenges that they faced over the 12-year period between the legalization of medicinal and the legalization of recreational, some of those challenges really informed policymakers and state officials as to how best to implement a system of recreational legalization. And so simply having in place a medical system is not necessarily a prerequisite for an effective recreational system, but both building upon the structures that you have and learning from the mistakes that you endure is absolutely critical really in any policy area, but certainly so in the policy area we've been talking about today. In addition to that, there was a really strong influence of leadership. And as someone who studies politics on a regular basis, there is no bigger throwaway term than leadership, if you try to define leadership or the impact of leadership and that. And so I'm not talking about this sort of diffuse way in which people often talk about this. You know, the economy would be great and there'd be peace in the world if only President Obama showed better leadership. And, you know, everything would have been great with the Iraq War and after Katrina if only George Bush were a better leader. That's usually garbage. But what happened in Colorado was that a lot of the leadership in the state put aside their own personal opposition to legalized marijuana and took a good governance approach and said, the voters have spoken, there's public will for this to happen, and we're going to implement it. If Governor Hickenlooper and others within the state took the approach that some in Washington take to a variety of policy areas in an effort to just blow it up at every chance they had, I can assure you that the situation in Colorado would not be what it is today. Instead, the leadership in the state, both in the governor's office, in the Department of Revenue, Department of Public Health, Transportation, but this extended too into industry. It extended even into opposition, which was hinted at a bit before. Alex talked about it before, that people were coming to the table, opponents were coming to the table and essentially saying, we've lost, let's try to have at least some input on this. Let's be adults about it, let's be mature about it. We didn't win on Amendment 64, but maybe we can get a little bit of what we want in the creation of regulations and the structuring of this system in Colorado. That's a maturity that you don't see in Washington on either side. And I was blown away by it in Colorado. I went into it with the bias of what I see in Washington every day, and I heard from opponents and supporters alike, opponents of Amendment 64 and supporters, and people who really didn't have a horse in the race, that they too were impressed with the behavior of the opposition in was a structure that ended up helping as well, and that was this cooperative, inclusive environment that relied on task forces and working groups to get the job done. Now, working groups, blue ribbon commissions and such also don't always work in Washington. Maybe this is more of a story about nothing works in Washington, and an original premise that things fail in the states is actually untrue. But task forces and working groups with a clear mission, a clear mandate, political support from leadership, political support from the public, and a real understanding that they had a job to do in a very short timeline led to what initially was the Task Force on the Implementation of Amendment 64, which was professional, was diverse in membership, had a series of working groups that focused on specific issues. It wasn't 10 people in a room who were going to conquer this entire challenge. It was a group of almost 40 core members who then recruited other peripheral members to help with issues like public health, like regulation, like legal issues. And that came together in a way that really helped inform legislators, helped inform the executive branch, both in terms of the governor's office, but also in terms of the day-to-day appointees and careerists who would deal with daily enforcement and the creation of the structures that would be in charge of enforcement. And that model, that task force and working group model, is a core part of implementation, carried through not just from the initial task force, but it continued through to subsequent iterations of implementation. Colorado needs to be lauded in seeing this not as a static, one moment in time effort to get marijuana legalization right. They saw it as a more fluid process by which they would tackle items and challenges and steps, and then go back to re-examine the choices that they made to see whether they were effective and working or whether they needed to be improved or adjusted. And that regulatory learning is something that anyone who studied regulation can tell you is absolutely important. Sometimes you don't get it right on the first time, on the first try. Sometimes you don't get it right on the 10th try. And part of that can be you made mistakes, and that's certainly plausible in an area that's as new as recreational marijuana legalization. But it's also true that changing dynamics, changing political and policy environments can cause a need for re-regulation or regulatory look back that was important. And so all of this came together to create a governing system that has largely, as I said, been effective. And one of the items that the core regulatory agency in Colorado, that being the Department of Revenue, in addition to this interest in regulatory look back, was an understanding of their own ignorance, which you often don't see in higher levels of government, or frankly lower levels of government, but they understood the limits of their own knowledge. And so they took steps, some of them quite controversial, in fact, some of them quite controversial to some people in this room, about how to move forward in this process in a way that preserved their own capacity to enforce. And so some of those choices included shrinking the size or limiting the size of the market initially, limiting the number of producers who would be able to participate. In fact, in Colorado, for a period of time, which generally statewide is ending soon, but there are other municipalities that have extended this, you could only produce recreational marijuana if you were an existing medical producer. There were a lot of reasons for that, and if we saw that in other areas of federal policy making, we would say, that's industry getting really cozy with the people who are enforcing or regulating them. But part of it too, and I'm not going to say that wasn't absent from that choice, but part of it was that the Department of Revenue, what was the Medical Marijuana Enforcement Division and is now the Marijuana Enforcement Division, realized that there were a bunch of producers who they knew and they knew well and they had been working with in some cases for a decade. And they would be able to, or not quite a decade, they would be able to continue to work with those individuals in a way that gave them better understanding about the market and the market actors, and thus greater capacity to do their job initially. And then as they settled into what was a brand new enforcement structure, they would then be able to expand the market slowly once they got their sea legs, so to speak, and the market will subsequently expand from there. Now, I say all this, that this is a largely successful rollout, implementation rollout, but as the paper acknowledges, there are several problems that have come up, and banking is one of the core ones, which I'm not going to belabor the point because the last panel did so in a much better fashion than I could, and B, in an absolutely magnificent fashion at that. But there are other issues that have been brought up here and there throughout the day. Differences in taxation between medical and recreational. Many in Colorado, for some reason, I still don't know, thought that there would be a transition away from the gray market, that is medical marijuana users who actually have no medical necessity, that they would say, oh, well, recreational marijuana is legal now, so I'm just going to transition from one market to the other. That choice would also involve paying an extra 25% in taxes, which at the start and still to a lesser extent continues to be on product with a base price that's higher. And so the transition from the gray market to the white market isn't happening, and there are a series of problems that the state is trying to tackle. One of them, for instance, is edibles. The state is conducting regulatory look back to try to get what has been seen as a serious problem by some in Colorado as issues with potency and dosing and serving sizes around edibles. But it shows that the state is trying to learn and is willing to learn from its mistakes. I got the 2-minute warning about a minute ago, but the one last thing I wanted to talk about was something that actually came up at the end of the last panel, and that was about the politics of this. And that's something that I feel I'm on much sturdier ground on to talk about. And it's one of the important effects that we're going to see coming out of marijuana policy in general. And so looking down the road at the initiatives that are coming up this year and then the initiatives that will be sure to come up in 2016, I wanted to give you all some statistics about the effect of a marijuana initiative on a ballot and what that can mean for the composition of the electorate. So if you compare voting numbers from 2008 to 2012, so 2 presidential years, which is the best way to, you shouldn't judge 2010 and 2012 or 2012 and 2014 because the electorates look so different. But from 2008 to 2012, the composition of the electorate in terms of ideology and in terms of age cohorts changed minimally at the national level. Essentially, the electorate in 2000, racially there were some differences, and gender-wise there was a slight difference. But in terms of age cohorts and in terms of ideology, there was very little difference nationally from 2008 to 2012. In Washington, however, in 2012, with a legalization measure on the ballot, the share of the electorate composed of by 18 to 29-year-olds jumped from 10% of the electorate to 21%. 18 to 24-year-olds jumped from 5% of the electorate to 13% of the electorate. Self-described liberals jumped from 27 to 31% of the electorate from 2008 to 2012. And of the people supporting Initiative 502 in Washington, 72% of them voted for President Obama. In Colorado, pretty similar numbers. From 08 to 12, the 18 to 29 demographic jumped from 14% of the electorate to 20%. 18 to 24-year-olds jumped from 5 to 12% of the electorate. Self-described liberals jumped from 17 to 28% of the electorate. And of the supporters of Amendment 64, 68% of them voted for President Obama over what was a statewide performance of the president of 51%. So it has really serious electoral effects moving forward. And I agree with Alex that in 5 to 10 years, there are a lot of reasons why we're going to see change, and I think part of it is that the people who, what political scientists call exiting the electorate, people who are dying, tend to be the most opposed to legalization. They are the people who have the highest rate of disapproval of legalization. The people entering the voting electorate, people turning from 17 to 18 and lower years up, they have some of the highest support for legalization. And so that's how you're seeing such dramatic swings over such a short period of time, because the most opposed individuals are being replaced by the most supportive individuals on this issue. And that's why I think 5 to 10 years is not a risky venture to go with. I'm done.
I am a lawyer and a law professor, but I think I aspire to be a normal person like Angela, and and partially that's because the theme of my talk is that lawyers and law professors aren't paying enough attention to this, and that social scientists are starting to pay attention to this, but not nearly as much as they should. And that's really where, to take a very literal approach to the title of our panel, the question posed is, what have we learned and what will we learn? And I answer the what have we learned, not very much, except that hardcore advocates will readily and eagerly spin as evidence that we've learned a lot, tiny little information that is inaccurate and or incomplete and or something that social scientists in the back of the room are nodding their head and like, yes, we've seen advocates do that all the time. And then what will we learn? And this is sort of the longer term theme of the work I'm doing here. I fear it remains not very much unless and until federal policy changes. That at the end of the day, especially if we want serious, rigorous, independent, well-checked, well-reviewed, well-examined research, and I am not enough of a researcher to have confidence that having the feds actively involved creates a gold standard, but I do know having the feds actively opposed creates I don't know what's the opposite of a gold standard, a crap standard or whatever the case may be. And that's been the part of the reality and part of the concern I have with respect to what's going on with the social science research here. Not to say that there isn't good work being done, but that unless and until the feds go from a universe of prohibition and one in which they seem eager to depress, if not outright prohibit, sophisticated research on a variety of marijuana-related questions, and I'll talk about the medical briefly, but then the broader social science more fully, that they not only need to get out of their prohibition approach to the work here, but I think it's going to be critical for them to actively protect, support, fund, urge the kind of rigorous research that's going to be needed to get to a point in which we can really make what I'd like to call evidence-based rather than instinct and advocacy-based choices in public policy. And I can provide a little context for my pessimistic what have we learned and what will we learn philosophy based on a quote from a New York Times editorial. And I won't tell you when this was written, although I've now tipped off to the gag here. The Times has lamented, "Few substances have been so flatly banned, yet so widely used as marijuana. So much discussed and yet so little researched." In the same editorial, they say, "The nation deserves better answers to the questions about pot." And I think we probably could all agree with those sets of sentiments. Of course, they were shared by the New York Times in 1970, which of course was the last kind of round of, my gosh, maybe we should change our policies here. And in fact, we got a federal commission known as the Schaefer Commission that did what still to this day is an extraordinarily thoughtful bit of good government, analyzing the stories of prohibition and coming to the conclusion that a criminalization of marijuana use particularly was generally a bad idea, a game not worth the candle, and recommended decriminalization and a variety of other recommendations. And this came just at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the Nixon administration largely ignored everything that was said there. Though, interestingly, and this is sort of the first round of we know so little, and I'm not particularly confident we're going to know a lot more unless and until the feds sort of not only get out of the way, but get behind supporting us learning more. 16 states, well, it depends on how you count, a dozen or so states move forward with decriminalization in the 70s as a result of the Schaefer Commission and other reform suggestions to move away from a criminalization model. Alaska did it sort of through court ruling. A few other states have come online. Some have gone on and off all the time. But there actually was, and this is sort of the point, a wave of marijuana reform 40 years ago. Why don't we know anything about that? Because we haven't done any research about that. Why haven't we done any research about that? Because the feds politically decided that's not something we want to support research behind. And particularly, and I was amazed it took until this last panel before the laboratories of democracy, the famous Brandeisian insight that states could try out a novel social and economic experiment and see how that goes without risk to other states, and that we'd all learn from it. Well, we all should be learning. I would hope we would be learning from that rich, diverse set of databases. And in fact, I got to find my list, but the states that have decriminalized really run the gamut geographically, politically, socially. There's a pretty rich natural experiment going on with decriminalization that we know nothing about. I mean, almost absolutely nothing, because there have been a little bit of research concerning whether decriminalization increased use. There's been a little bit of research about whether decriminalization has reduced costs for law enforcement. But when I say a little bit of research, I really mean, at least in terms of what I've seen cited, a paper every 5 years or so, and like all good social science papers, this raises a lot more questions than it answers, and then those questions never get followed up, and we don't know. We don't know. And I don't think anybody is busy studying, and certainly in the wake of all of the wonderful energy that Colorado and Washington are creating about recreational marijuana, I don't think anybody's going to be studying anytime soon all these basic questions of harm and public policy effect that everybody is now hyper-focused on in Colorado and Washington, whether we're talking about underage use from the earlier discussion, drugged driving, which is a very sort of popular and hot one, how much, as Angela mentioned, the savings we might get in terms of reduced criminalization and criminal justice enforcement that comes from that. We've got 16 states doing decriminalization where we could be looking into that, but we're not. Now, again, why aren't we? Because it's in nobody's economic interest to look into that kind of stuff. That's the broader reality where kind of my cynicism meets with realism, that usually you don't get good research on anything unless somebody's going to make a buck from the good research. And so that's part of that story, and that's also where the feds sometimes do a good job of filling those gaps. They tend to fund research in a variety of ways that aren't just about making money in a capitalist system, but are about trying to move forward with good public policy. But in this arena, they haven't thought that decriminalization could even be on the table as good public policy, and so they've had no interest, and funding's been challenging to get money surrounding that. Well, that's kind of a junior varsity story, and I want to suggest it remains kind of a junior varsity story. I don't want anybody to take away from this. I've got a research agenda now. Let me look at all the decriminalization states and run some numbers for Berman and make him happy, and he'll say I'm the greatest social scientist and or researcher ever, although I probably would say that because I'd be happy to say that. But the one that really makes my head hurt these days, and it's partially because I keep looking for information because you would think there ought to be a lot by now, and there's some, but there's still not a lot, is the medical marijuana experiment that's now been going on for close to 20 years when we think about California. California has had pretty full-scale medical marijuana going on since 1996. Now, that's overbroad because there have been lots of changes in law and policy along the way that has radically impacted the marketplace. And among the things that hasn't gotten mentioned that much, though it should be if we were zeroing in on medical marijuana, a lot of which has been eclipsed now at this stage by all the recreational talk, is the Ogden memo from 2009, where the Obama administration said, hey, we're going to live up to our promise to not get too tough on you medical marijuana folks. That was largely a green light to the industry, much more so than anybody else. And the industry started to emerge circa 2009. There's a wonderful documentary, actually, that I would encourage everybody who's obsessed about these topics like I am to watch, called Code of the West, that highlights how Montana's industry mushroomed dramatically in the wake of the Ogden memo, and then that led to a political backlash in the Montana legislature to change legislatively their medical marijuana regulations and so on and so forth. And to me, that laboratory, not only has it been going on for 20 years in California, and there's lots of assertions about what's going on in California. Oh, it's not really medical marijuana, it's really used as an excuse for young people to do recreational, but we don't really know, or I'll go even further, and this is itself part of my, I don't know if it's a challenge to the policymakers or a challenge to the social scientists or just a challenge to all of it. You could say, let me put it differently, advocates might be inclined to say at one level, all moderate marijuana use is medical use, right? Because it's presumably someone who feels better when they do it. And as long as they're not doing it to a point that it causes personal public health problems, and again, I guess I can piggyback off Mark mentioning, okay, for kids, that's not true, right? But there's lots of medicines we don't think kids should take. In fact, most medicines are tested separately for kids than they are for adults. And our general sense of what defines a medicine is if an adult person feels better from taking it. Now, of course, and Mark mentioned this point, we have a distribution scheme for medicine that is controlled by a variety of regulatory forces, but I'm not necessarily sure that's a wonderful model for certain medicines. We certainly don't use it for the medicine of alcohol. Now, whether people think alcohol qualifies as a medicine is an interesting sort of question. We don't use it for the medicine of sugar or caffeine or whatever other things that we might want to call a medicine. Or here I'm really piggybacking off of Alec's wonderful book about controlled substances, which starts with a whole big chapter on what is a drug. You know, gambling is a drug. People get addicted to all sorts of other sorts of things. And so I'm not making the full-throated argument that any responsible use of marijuana is medical use. I am highlighting that one of the problems with a failure to have robust research concerning medical marijuana in California, in a bunch of other states as they emerge and come online, and Alex particularly emphasized that the number of states coming online with medical marijuana may be as important, if not more important, for the overall national pattern that we're going to see. We just haven't even engaged, and I don't think the social scientists have engaged that robustly on, yes, this really is responsible use. Whether we call that medical use or non-medical use or whatever it is, this is the kind of use that in all likelihood is going to produce no more harm than benefit to this individual and society at large. And again, part of the problem with the medical research even is every time a study comes out that says maybe somebody could possibly be helped by THC or CBC, the advocates all run and say, look, here's another bit of evidence that shows it's not a Scheduled I drug. And every time somebody else comes out with a study that says, hey, kids' brains might get hurt a little bit, other advocates say, yeah, but not compared to tobacco or not compared to alcohol or not compared to Twinkies or whatever the case may be. And so we just get the advocates who flood to all of this material, and nobody, not only is nobody sorting it out, right? To me, the issue is not just we've had these ongoing laboratories and nobody's really been able to, for whatever sets of reasons, and I do think federal prohibition is a huge part of that equation, study them rigorously and start to give us a kind of, and again, here's the lawyer in me inclined to describe it this way, sort of a common law base of basic knowledge about what may or may not be working, and even a reasonable dialogue that we've developed with things like alcohol and tobacco. Now, that's changed over time, right? Our vision of what's responsible tobacco use, our vision of what's responsible alcohol use has changed over time. It used to be, at least if I can believe what I see on Mad Men, you know, it was perfectly responsible to drink like a fish and then get in your car, and then we figured out, no, that's really bad, right? So this gets back to my assertion to Mark that, you know, we work our way back to moderateness even though the alcohol industry continues to be against most drunk driving regulations, right? The alcohol industry has, this is where I know from the criminal justice side, worked very hard against one criminal justice public policy innovation that would probably save, you know, close to 10,000 lives a year, which is breathalyzers passively built into our cars, right? We can, through technology, ensure that very few people are able to drink and drive, and that some people will say, well, that can be evaded, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, everything can be invaded, right? That's part of Mark's point earlier about we shouldn't expect legal regulation or even other forms to keep kids from getting access to marijuana, but we can, through a variety of regulatory mechanisms, reduce harm. And yet we have some pretty good research on ignition locks when it comes to drunk driving, but the industry is trying to stop that. We have no good information at all about whether drug driving is going up or down really in medical marijuana states, because nobody's really caring about making it work or not work except the people who want to prove that should be in quotes, right, who want to tell you it's now been proven that this is a disaster or not a disaster, right? And that's, I guess, another part of the story of what Alex and Mark were talking about earlier concerning how both sides of the industry seem to be, working at not just cross purposes, but can't come to a central point to work through some decent regulations, because what they really care about is their side winning, and they'll run the data, they'll actually manufacture the data, and manufacture researchers to do data that will support their side, knowing what they want the outcome to be ahead of time. The other theme, though, that I want to stress, not just that we need more research and good research, and we're probably going to need the feds to get out of the way and hopefully support more quality research over time to get the data we need, because we've had these ongoing experiments that we have no data on so far, and I'm not confident we will get a lot of data on until more people are looking at all of this legitimately. But it's about data about a heck of a lot more. It's information about so many more stories than just use, abuse, drug driving, how does it relate to crime, how many criminals come up with positive THCs. There are so many topics, and this is where me as not just lawyer, but former good law student who's good at spotting issues. I can spot the 10,000 questions I have every time I look at this that nobody seems to even be asking, let alone that we're providing decent answers on, right? So my particular favorite, and it was primed a little bit by John's point before, race and gender. I have no idea, and I don't know if anybody has good data. I'm not sure you can collect good data in the wake of federal prohibition. How many of people who use medical marijuana, who have a decent claim to medical marijuana, are socioeconomically disadvantaged, are women versus men, are certain racial groups versus other racial groups? There's a huge literature, and a justifiably huge literature, about how poor our healthcare systems are at delivering decent healthcare, decent pain relief, decent medical insurance, you name it, to people who are suffering from different classes, socioeconomically, gender, and so on. And I very much think a lot of marijuana use is self-medication through a means other than legitimate healthcare system. And is that what's going on in California? California would seem to be an incredible laboratory to explore that, right? Certainly, and I have every reason to believe there's robust age stories here that we sort of have a feel for, but not really. And again, part of that story, and it's been articulated with respect to the medical science as well. One of the reasons it's very hard to do medical science in this arena is because of federal prohibition. Not just it's hard to do legitimate science experiments, getting access legally to the materials you need. There was a interesting story out of Arizona recently of a researcher who was trying to do an authorized PTSD study and lost her job, although there's lots of controversy over that, whether that's why she lost her job, trying to do a marijuana PTSD study on veterans concerning the medical part of things in Arizona. But folks being willing to be willing subjects. Folks being willing to be willing subjects and honest subjects in any medical experiment. Put the medical experiment aside, admitting you have a medical marijuana card and are a regular medical marijuana user for experimental purposes almost ensures you're on a list somewhere. If the feds decide to change policy, they can go after you. And so I don't know if the social science researchers struggle too much with these sets of issues, because I'm sure you can do things blind and ensure anonymity and all of that, but I'm sure that distorts results, or at the very least, you have to worry about it distorting results. Beyond that side of things, and this is the last piece that I want to say, and it piggybacks off a regular comment of, which I love to think, well, all this is due to the GDP of Ohio, right? California is an interesting marketplace. The business side of this, the economics of this, the job creation, right? So one of the things, Angela made this point, don't make too big a deal about how much taxes you're going to get in, because that's a really complicated story. But maybe you can make a big deal about how much you save in law enforcement resources. I want to make a big deal, and this actually comes from the Ohio story. We got casinos here in Ohio because the industry finally figured out, don't sell it as freedom, don't sell it as don't you like to gamble, don't sell it as, they sold it a little bit as everyone's running over to other states and they're getting the tax money, but at the end of the day they sold it as jobs, 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 jobs. You'll get 4,000 jobs here if we get casinos. And I don't know if we've gotten the 4,000 jobs here with the casinos, but I do know that for me, especially in down economic times, especially, John and I talked about this as well, when there's particularly a huge number of people who I fear are involved in gray and black markets, not just with respect to marijuana, but with respect to a lot of other drug and illegal market activities that are there because of a otherwise down economy, and particularly a down economy that isn't especially friendly to people with lower socioeconomic status and other relative disadvantage educationally and elsewhere. Is that who the industry is employing? Is that who the industry should be employing, right? One of the big stories that actually worries me a lot about this going from the medical grayness, which it right now is, into a much more legalized, legitimized, state-regulated world is the first thing the state regulators always say is anybody who's got a felony record, anybody who's done anything bad in their life ever, you're never getting a license, you're never going to get involved in this, you're never going to do this, and I don't want to go so far as to turn this into an immigration debate to suggest that, illegals are probably, getting opportunities to stay involved in the industry in California and elsewhere through that, but I don't know, right? This is all anecdote and speculation because nobody's collecting this data to my knowledge, nobody's able to collect this data to my knowledge, and nobody, I think, unless they already have their position figured out about what's good policy going forward, is going to help collect this data unless and until the feds get out of the way, right? And so this is a story not just of there's so many questions that I want answered just so I can figure out what I think about a lot of these issues. I especially fear that while the feds, which has long had a history through DEA and others of getting in the way of even the medical science part of this, I think they're going to stay in the way and feel pressure to stay in the way of the social science of this unless and until policies change. And so for me, that's where I'm, I guess, most rooting for federal prohibition to go away. I'd love it, right? This would be the way I would, of course, structure it if I was king of the world or president of the United States, whatever it is. We need a national commission to study this, and the people who have stuck around for a conference this long should all be the members of that commission, because obviously we're the only people, at least in this part of Ohio right now, who have the time and the energy to really look carefully at this kind of stuff. But that, at the end of the day, the one last piece I'll add in just for fun for this audience, especially for anybody who stayed around, I really want to know about the legal marketplace, i.e., the marketplace of lawyers serving this industry, because to me that's another piece of this story, which is itself another interesting story that you learn if you learn the history of Prohibition. One of the most successful bootleggers used to be a lawyer, and he got started by being the lawyer to the alcohol folks right before Prohibition came in, and then he quickly figured out, oh, wow, rather than defend these guys, I'll just be the bootlegger myself, and he became one of the kings of the bootlegger industry. And so the relationship between lawyers, regulators, and the industry, I think, is an area that ought to particularly capture our attention when, despite a slightly resurgent economy or recovering economy that creeps along, the legal marketplace especially is one that I think risks having less than responsible people become the representatives in this industry, in part because federal prohibition makes it that much harder for responsible lawyers to take this on and take it on in a responsible, above-board way. I think I probably went over my time. I usually do, but we still have plenty of time for Q&A.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative. I guess initially starting on the politics front, perhaps in anticipation of this conference, or perhaps just because he saw us on poll numbers, the Democratic candidate for governor in Ohio came out in favor of medical marijuana this week, and instantly the pundits suggested that he was just looking at perhaps the data you cited about turnout of younger voters. One thing that's been discussed in Ohio, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this, is one thing that's likely to end up on the ballot in the next several years, or at least people say could end up on the ballot in Ohio in the next several years, is a medical marijuana initiative. I believe there are 3 groups that have their proposed language that have been seeking to collect signatures. The other thing that's been talked about as possibly getting on the ballot in one of the next few election cycles is a same-sex marriage referendum to undo the amendment that was enacted, I guess, in 2004. And is there much data on, and one argument that comes up when people talk about this in Ohio is, was the argument I've seen made, and I'd be curious whether or not this is accurate, that individually a marijuana initiative or a same-sex marriage initiative each bring out proponents, which also tend to be younger and more Democratic-leaning voters, but that if they were both on the ballot at the same time, they would then actually, they wouldn't double up because they'd be largely attracting many of the same voters, but the combination would actually draw out a lot of opponents to both who might not be inclined to come out just to oppose one, but would be inclined to come out to oppose both. And is that just pundit speculation? Is there data that might suggest that that's true?
So I think we need to think about the effect of electoral turnout with the backdrop of these initiatives. And so it is true that when initiatives are on the ballot, that they are obviously having some sort of turnout effect. There's research out of the University of Florida that suggests that the 2004 constitutional amendments to ban same-sex marriage did generate some conservative turnout, particularly here in Ohio, in ways that had noticeable effects on results, although I don't recall I don't think the study suggested that it determined the outcome, but it certainly had effects. And so having these in presidential election years also brings the benefit of the fact that there are a lot of these voters who are turning out anyways. So what I talked about earlier was the percentage of the electorate being composed of these age groups. You have to have in the backdrop there that there's just a larger core number of voters anyways. And so in a presidential election year, you're going to have voters who are going to help these initiatives come along, and then the initiatives are going to bring voters on their own, which is going to help the initiatives, and then Democratic candidates as well. And so there are a lot of forces at play. It's not necessarily a linear relationship or a singular relationship. But what I will say is that, in general, there is much more passion opposing same-sex marriage among certain reliable, easy to turn out constituencies than there are in opposition to medical marijuana. And so if I were advising initiative writers or the teams that are working on this, in an entirely cynical way, medical marijuana supporters might be resistant to having a same-sex marriage initiative on the ballot at the same time, because they're bringing, now, people who oppose same-sex marriage, my guess is, also have not the most progressive views on legalization or for medical marijuana, though I don't have data on that. I would think that's true. It's risky for supporters to have both on the ballot at the same time. You're not adding anything with the same-sex marriage initiative for supporters, but you certainly are adding more opponents. And so from sort of a freedom perspective, if normatively you should want both on there if you're in favor of liberalizing both laws, but there are some serious political consequences to that choice for Ohioans.
So I'll respond to a good question about data with a law professor's version of data, which is a personal anecdote. And the personal anecdote, which I think is really interesting in light of that question, was being called out to a meeting literally the day after the 2010 election in California, where a group was getting together, scheming is a terrible pejorative word there, planning how they were going to try to draft and move forward with a ballot initiative to modify California's three strikes laws. And this is all public now because it was put on the ballot and it passed in 2012. What was so fascinating about that meeting circa 2010 was the early conversation was, hey, I hear there's another group getting together that's thinking about putting repeal of the death penalty on the ballot. And the big funder who was pushing the repeal of three strikes said at that meeting, well, if they're going to be on the ballot, I don't want us on the ballot because it means there'll be this sort of twin force that law enforcement will get out and send everybody out to vote no on both those things, and we'll be associated with it, and it's clear that an anti-death penalty ballot will die, and that will drag down ours. And so that was kind of, where the meeting left. We got to find out if they're going to be serious. Well, it turns out those folks were serious. They got a anti-death penalty initiative on the ballot. What had ended up happening, despite all of that smart political wisdom in the room, was that became the whole topic of conversation, and the three strikes reform got largely ignored, and the sense was, well, I'm for reform, I'm not so far that I'm willing to pass death penalty repeal, but of course I'm going to vote for three strikes reform because that's not that big a deal at all, and so that's moderate in relation. Now, those are obviously associated issues, but I think it highlights that even if you look back at past initiative plans, you just don't know where the electorate will be, particularly, and I think this is the point that John was picking up on in a different way, and that is where the money is going to be invested, both in running campaigns on the airwaves and in actually as I understand most GOTV realities, getting your buses to go to places and get people to out on the polls, or to, get them their forms to early vote, depending on what the jurisdiction is. That's where it really hits. And if it turns out that there are more motivated, and by more motivated I also probably mean people with a lot more money, who are going to fund getting out a certain voting block, right? And that's the other thing that's been really interesting about watching the medical marijuana initiatives. And let me just finish by saying Florida is the place to watch this election cycle for people who I think should be very interested in the relationship between these initiatives and broader voting realities, not just because they've got a very broad, I would say, California-like medical marijuana initiative on the ballot, which my sense is most of the medical community is opposed to, but that there's strong lawyer support. That's what's driven it. A guy named John Morgan, who has lots of money from tort litigation, but whose, I think, dad had cancer and used medical marijuana in his late days, and so is very personally motivated about this. But he's poured an incredible amount of money both into the initiative and into Charlie Crist's campaign to become governor. Charlie Crist, I think, is the only serious nominee to vocally support an initiative for marijuana reform while in that same election cycle. So I might be wrong about that, but I think it's right that a top-line candidate basically banking on, among the way I'll be able to take down an incumbent, and might have a chance to do that, right? I mean, others have supported it, but they've been long shots, and I think that's where Ed Fitzgerald fits in, although there's not an ongoing initiative either that's going on there. And I especially think the political world will look closely at all these demographics coming out, like who voted for Charlie Crist, who voted for the medical marijuana initiative, who spent money on this and that. And the last piece of that is Sheldon Adelson, who I would think has no interest whatsoever in marijuana policy in Florida that I could possibly think of, gave $2 million to the Don't Let Florida Go to Pot campaign. It's the biggest single donation to an anti-pot movement, and that's fascinating if you follow campaign finance, if you follow Sheldon Adelson, if you follow GOP stuff, and that's the other piece that I think is going to be really, really interesting to watch. And I suspect there'll be lots of moneyed interest at the national level that will be focused on that as we move into the 2016 cycle.
On the issue of what we know and don't know, is the problem, two ways we could put it. One we could say is, for whatever reason, researchers haven't been all that interested in researching marijuana reform, and certainly when it comes to medical marijuana, there are some things the federal government, certainly like medical research itself, obstructs. But another hypothesis might be this is a broader public policy problem, that researchers and academics in particular tend not to be interested in state government. And with the exception of a Brookings book from several years ago that Paul Teskey wrote, that I pimp for whenever I get the chance, called Regulation in the States, which has a wonderful series of case studies looking at different types of regulation and how state policies affect one another. There are relatively few serious studies of state-level policy reform and its effect, and that this is, in general, not what law professors do. It's not what people seeking tenure at academic institutions do. And I'm just wondering, is it both? Is it one or the other? Why is it that we, after 20 years of medical marijuana, can't say more with certainty about what the effects of that have been, and or what the best practices perhaps might be at the state level?
So I'd say there's definitely some work that's out there that's pretty good stuff that you can look to. I mean, some of the people in the room have written on this. I think there have been some real missed opportunities in looking at medical marijuana in a systematic cross-state way. There are structural reasons for that. I think there are funding reasons for that. People aren't interested in funding projects about that. People aren't interested in making it their path to tenure. I think that's true. Or you suggest it's true among law faculty. I wouldn't know, but it's certainly true among policy, public policy. In focus on the states, the bias against that is certainly true among political science faculty. It is not a robust part of our field, and so. Yeah, I think in addition to missed opportunities about there being, a number of cases that we can look at, data collection isn't always great state to state. That's a real challenge for a quantitative researcher like myself. But where it is effective and reliable and useful. I think people aren't doing enough of it, and I think there's structural reasons in the academy for that. I think you're right on both parts.
I want to hear what the social scientists have to say to that question. Because I do think that's an excellent point, Jonathan, about the sort of anti-state bias that pervades legal academy in general. Although, to me, part of what's so interesting about that is you could readily, and I would imagine folks, and this is another bias we have against empiricism, but, I would love to know from just a law professor realm, how many people have filed suit with federal constitutional claims when they've been prosecuted in medical marijuana states, right? How much is that even coming up as an argument? How much court time is being spent on that kind of stuff? Certainly there's a lot of research on state level policing, right? And so that's the part, especially when we talk about police practices and that part of the criminal justice system. Almost all of that research is state level because it has to be, and it doesn't make sense to look at it in other ways. And again, that's the one where both the decriminalization story and the medical marijuana story, there's just so little conversation. And here, particularly for me, and this is where the criminal justice side of me really kicks in, wanting more, to the extent that there's all this debate and discussion, and I think rightly so, and I think Mark referenced it a little bit too. We don't even know if marijuana, as often claimed, is a gateway drug to other drugs, or may actually be a reverse gateway and a way to get out of other drugs and all of that. I very much want to know whether marijuana enforcement is sort of a gateway to higher involvement in higher criminal justice, school to prison pipeline kind of stuff. That's particularly the hottest, sort of greatest area of robust research in the criminal justice reform communities. Our school discipline policies are terrible and they're much too harsh, especially in inner cities and in depressed areas, because kids get treated because they're poor and black and brown much more harshly when they get in a fight in school, and then that gets them in the juvenile system, and once in the juvenile system, then they're on probation, and then they get a dirty urine, and now they're on their way to prison, and so on and so forth. And I keep looking for somebody in there to say, and gosh, if we just reformed marijuana law, all of that would change, or none of that would change, and nobody's, even thinking about teasing out that kind of story, and partially because they're working on other projects, and I can't fault them for not making sure their projects are what I care about, but there's a piece of it where, there's so much intersectionality, but also, again, I think so few who even feel like it's legitimate to be able to responsibly say, yes, this is something that the feds have gotten so wrong, and all we need to do is really study that, and then we'll be able to essentially show either the feds have gotten that so wrong or they've gotten it so right. That's already fraught, not just legally and structurally, but even sort of socially. I mean, I still get jokes about coming to conferences like this, and I think we all will for 4 or 5 more years.
Questions? Do the social scientists want to say anything about research agendas and research on states versus the federal government?
I have a couple of comments.
Sure.
On this. First of all, I think it might be, related to this was the issue of how can you do good quality research in this world, because it is illegal under federal law, and do you really want people responding to these questions, and how credible are they? Well, there actually is a mechanism through the federal government for protection to your subjects. So if we do work that involves criminal offenders all the time, and we deal with drug-involved individuals, we take biospecimens, hair samples all the time, and we can protect them and their samples by getting a certificate of confidentiality issued through the federal government. So you can do the research. There's a mechanism for that sort of protection.
But for curiosity, are those people already in the criminal justice system, though?
Yeah.
Right. So if you were to go out and say to a whole bunch of people,
No, both. No, it doesn't matter who they are. Sorry, inside and outside. You can get protection on their data. So they are not allowed to come and pursue your data from you if you have the certificate.
And do you have any problem recruiting people to be part, if they're completely, you just walked up to me and say, we want to have you part of a drug survey and all of this, and trust us, the feds will keep all that quiet.
Well, the nice thing about working with criminal justice populations is they understand confidentiality. They've usually had a lawyer that's explained that to them. So
Well, they're already in the system and they have no choice whether to participate, right?
Well, we work with people who are drug involved in drug treatment programs, not necessarily through the criminal justice system. And most people tend to get and there's informed consent that would do that. So you can, and then of course you can either believe or not believe what they tell you, and that's why we love bioassay. I mean, hair is fantastic because you get a long window of very good quality understanding of use, right? So that work is there. And the really
I won't make a joke about bald bias, but that's okay.
Well, we can usually find hair.
Oh, great. I keep looking too, so, I appreciate all the help I can get.
You don't need a lot of it to get some good data. It turns out that that the federal government this year made a really big push in terms of research support for marijuana research in the social sciences. So not just thinking now about like medical studies, but actually like what are the behavioral responses to these sorts of innovations. And it was a very competitive mechanism. A lot of research flooded in, and I think that will be really expanded. So NIH, and which is, by the way, of course, the best quality research comes through the federal level. I know we hate to say that, but it's true. And the reason is they have the best quality review mechanisms.
Yeah.
So the best quality research gets funded. But that means it's such a high quality review because people get to have equal say in whether they want your research funded. And there's a lot of people out there who still think marijuana is funny and silly. So you often have this bias in the review process, not the federal side. The external reviewers who are well vetted and the best scientists just think it's still kind of silly. So that's not it's not the fault of the federal government, it's the fault of the public. Academia should recognize this as a serious issue that needs to be funded. And then it's risky. The reason you don't see more research is that it's really risky. If you want to run a big research portfolio, you almost always have to rely on soft money because you can't be in the classroom, you can't be doing other things, you have to be doing it. Now, if you're I'm a hard money researcher. That means I'm fully funded as a professor, and I manage research because I just love it on the side. But for my colleagues who are soft money researchers, doing good research in marijuana is so risky because if you love data the way we do, if you go into this field and you honestly want to pursue truth, if you follow that truth and that truth tells you marijuana has a positive outcome for this group, immediately you're labeled as an advocate for legalization. Yep. And it's very hard to get your next round of soft money. Alternatively, if your data says, hey, no, marijuana screws this up, it's impossible to get the next round of soft money. So it's a very risky business on the researcher's side.
You want to add to that, or?
Well, but we are in fact cranking out a bunch of results.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's I think a general comment, and I would just say in terms of the legal academy, I mean, you can see it in a lot of fields, constitutional law being the most conspicuous example where, especially if you don't have tenure, you might want to write on constitutional law as long as it's federal. I mean, the publication bias and so on is very much discourages people from doing serious state level research, and there's already, at least in some parts of legal academy, some suspicion of empirical research. So I mean, it's something of a double whammy. But questions? Do you have a question, or okay? Professor Denning had a question down here.
The last comment actually raises an issue that I'm curious about. I mean, why do we have any confidence that the production of high quality empirical research will make an impact one way or the other among people who have a commitment? I mean, in other words, is there a cultural cognition aspect to marijuana that we haven't quite sorted through? And for those of you not familiar, some researchers at Yale, Dan Kahan and some of his associates have taken surveys with people, and they find when you control for all sorts of things, that your worldview, whether you're communitarian or individualistic, et cetera, dictates a lot of your positions on things like climate change, on gun control, et cetera. And I wonder if marijuana and drug policy is one of those, meaning you're unlikely to move somebody by citing research because they'll either reduce the cognitive dissonance by dismissing it or search harder for research that they think counters it, et cetera. So I just throw that out there as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research in this area that does suggest that people's views on things are sticky. They're going to remain with what their predisposition is. But there's also a lot of experimental research that suggests even small amounts of information can have at least short-term effects on certain people's perspectives, voting habits. In fact, Rob's wife does some spectacular work on this in studying political behavior in the experimental setting. And so I'm someone who's quite cynical about the American voter, but this is an area where I think there are certainly people who have their minds made up. But I actually think with marijuana, in whether it's legalization recreationally or medically, I think there are a lot of people who can be moved. I think, see too often people who are very staunch advocates on either side. But I look at my parents who don't have particularly strong views on the issue, who I think could be swayed by what they hear on the news or some set of research or what they read in the newspaper, because they're just not that passionate about the issue. It's not, I mean, it is a social issue by a lot of definitions, but it's not abortion. It's not same-sex marriage. It's something that scares some people but doesn't rile such incensed passions among 90% of the population. And so because of that, I think there is some space from a democratic perspective, a small d democratic perspective, to have this research as long as it's packaged and set in a way to be easily consumed by the average voter, both in terms of the amount of time that they need to take to consume it and its complexity, to really have some pretty substantial effects. I think we've seen this on same-sex marriage a little bit from what we've seen about experiential effects, but I think it's true on marijuana as well.
Do we know much about how much of that, in the case of something like same-sex marriage and perhaps even, or any other issue that's like this, how much of that is experience as opposed to hard data? So for example, let's look in the context of state policy experimentation. The Paul Teskey book I mentioned finds evidence that states learn from their neighbors. It's not clear though precisely what the mechanism is.
Yeah.
But it does, it may be as simple as you look across the border and you see they have more tax revenue or a certain industry is growing and you just go, well, gosh, we should just replicate what they did. It may be something more formal. And I'm just wondering, do we know much about how much is it research that a lot of us like to do and like to read, and how much is it, you go to Colorado and it didn't seem like a crazy place, so you're not worried about that anymore.
Well, I can't speak to that on in terms of marijuana policy. Maybe some others in the room can, but there is research that suggests that people knowing people who are in same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships can liberalize views on the issue, and as people come out to their friends and family and neighbors, that experience can have an effect. I mean, you can imagine a parallel, like you suggested, of no longer seeing marijuana users as the jobless basement living stoner, but as someone dressed like we are today who goes home and instead of a martini, takes a couple of hits or vapes a little. So I think as people's perceptions of what the marijuana user, what the perceptions are, that can change minds in the way that people's perceptions of what two people in a same-sex relationship, what that perception is, has changed views as well.
So, first, to support your point, there's been enormous change on attitudes toward cannabis, and relatively little of that has been generational turnover. Some of it,
Sure.
but most of it has been within cohort changing attitudes. So it's clear that this is an area where people's attitudes are valuable because they're in fact changing. Whether it's experiential research is hard to tell. I'm often reminded of the remark of the guy who's in charge of research at the Office of National Drug Control Policy for many years. He was asked whether he thought that research could influence drug policy. He said yes, especially bad research. The discouraging note on the experiential side, this is something that Galston and Dion report based on the abuse stuff. Yes, if you know someone that you know is gay, your probability of supporting same-sex marriage goes way up. If you know somebody that you know is a pot smoker, your probability of supporting cannabis legalization does not go way up. And discouragingly, the reality of heavy pot smoking is not people in this room who go home and have a smoke after work. Heavy pot smokers look a lot like tobacco smokers. John Calkins has calculated that something like 60% of all days of cannabis use are by people who do not have a high school diploma. In fact, cannabis at the moment is benefiting from cultural lag. People are still thinking of hippies with flowers in their hair.
Yeah.
As typical cannabis smokers, and that's simply not the case.
Yeah, I think that's right. EJ and Bill's work that you mentioned do suggest that, and I think the difference there between the experiential results on same-sex marriage and that is exactly what you said, and that is that what people are seeing as the experience is not necessarily what isn't necessarily all of the marijuana users that they know around them. So for work reasons, for social reasons, for family reasons, people are still in the closet marijuana users, whereas I think people, ironically, are it may be much easier for them to come out of the closet in terms of their sexual orientation to family or at work especially, than it is to come out of the closet as a marijuana user. And so I wonder if the sample from which people's experience is drawing is just not the right type of user. I think you're right. If you're thinking of heavy marijuana smokers, yeah, there should be no reason why your opinion should say, oh, well, I support marijuana because this guy's stoned all the time. I mean, I think, but your point is well taken.
Any other questions? All right, well, one benefit of getting to do programs like this is being able to have interesting questions and then get a group of interesting people who know a lot more about the subject than I do to come and share some of their wisdom. And I certainly appreciate the work all the folks that came here today and all of you for hanging around. Thank you for coming. Look for the papers to be published in the law review, and please join me in thanking not just this panel, but all of our panelists. Would also like to thank Nancy and the Academic Center support staff for helping make this possible, the AV folks who the webcast. And the law review students whose work on this has only really not just begun, if that, and we'll get to look forward to working with the authors on these papers. But thank you again, and behind this wall, so if you go out either door and go around, we have a reception. Please join us for that, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you again.
Thank you, John.